And at this point, we will have, in terms of norms, we will have a panel that comes on towards the end for a Q&A session. But I want to thank you all for coming, and I'm going to hand it over to Christine Montgomery, who will lead us with this first part.
Thank you, Bianca, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our How to Be an Anti-Racist Scientist. My name is Christine Montgomery. I'm the CSUPERB program specialist. I just started in December of 2018. So far, I have most of the time from home and COVID-19 office, but nonetheless, I've been working. A little bit about me. I have a master's in criminal justice criminology, and I focused research on studying officers here in San Diego. And so we're going to kind of talk and see how this bias overlaps in STEM and how it's part of the context of why these protests started up in the last few months or so. So let's get started. Okay, so like I mentioned before, was as a response in light of the recent killing of Black Americans and the protests that erupted after. And so these protests let us know that the time to eradicate racism is now. And so we developed this webinar just to be inclusive and to also build within our CSUPERB community an aspect of anti-racism. And so this webinar is not a one-stop shop, but it's just an introduction to combat racism within our lives and within STEM. And since we're biotech, we fall under that STEM category. And we'll send out a survey at the end of this webinar and at the end in the next few days. And we want you to tell us what you want to learn more about. Tell us what you didn't know. Tell us how we can best assist you in navigating this topic at your campus, in your classes, and we will be putting together programming that will really develop on focus on eradicating racism. So for this presentation, we have a few outcomes. We're going to look at the history and data of unequal treatment of African Americans in America. And while this webinar is centered on anti-racism in the terms of African Americans, we will show how Latinx is right next to it. And so we'll be able to cover both of those today. We'll look at the relevancy of racism in STEM and education. We'll discuss racism today and what it looks like in terms of implicit bias and microaggressions. And we'll discuss how to respond, what next steps we can take, and then we'll have a discussion with some comments and responses and to some questions that we prompt. All right, so let's start with lexicon, and we just want to define some terms so we can all be on the same page. So racism is the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So what we're really seeing here is that race determines our traits, and then one race is superior. It's a belief in that. And specifically in America, we have white supremacy, and that's the belief that the white race is the inherent superior race, and that all other races should be controlled by the white race. When we look at institutional racism, also known as systematic racism, we see that this occurs in organizations, and it's treatments, policies, practices that are based on race. But the key here is that there's an equitable result for people, and it favors white people over people of color. And this is extremely important to note, that it extends past prejudice. It's just not about someone not liking you for the color of your skin. This has real implications in your life and how you're viewed in society. And so next we want to talk about structural racism. So structural racism is the bedrock, the foundation. It's the overarching system between institutions and society. And so when you think of structural racism, think about historical aspects, social aspects, cultural aspects that allow racism to perpetuate, and then think how institutions are involved in that. And so you can just kind of see it as a holistic view of a society. And so when we talk about anti-racist, It's someone who's made a decision, right? It's a conscious decision to dismantle and fight against racism at all levels. And so we can look at the personal levels, that's ourselves and our everyday lives. As the institutional level, that would be the CSU system, CSUPERB, our campuses, our departments, right? Our classrooms, those institutional levels. And then structural is just the broader context of society, cultural, things that we see in the media, things that allow for this foundation of racism to exist. And so we want to really make sure that we are anti-racist, because racism is endemic in America. It's not enough to just be non-racist. You have to make a conscious choice to decide that you're going to not perpetuate it, and also that you're going to fight against it. All right, so when we look at racism and we think about those levels, one thing we want to note is the difference between overt racism and covert racism. And so just some simple definitions for the sake of this webinar is that racism that is done openly is overt, and that looks like slavery, that looks like Jim Crow, that looks like segregation, redlining practices that we know were done based on the color of someone's skin, right? And then covert racism is under the radar. It's racism that is not open. And that's what we see currently, mass incarceration, right? Where it's not something that we see every day in our eyes, but the data helps us show that there's some systematic oppression there. And this timeline over here, it just helps us understand the framework that what we're dealing with is from at least the 1600s. And to know that our structural racism is apparent in society even before America was formed in 1776 as a free nation. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about this. All right, so let's look at mass incarceration. And you can see here in this slide, if you look where the box is, in 2018, these are stats from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and you can see the numbers at the three set of numbers at the right. We'll see the rates of people incarcerated by race per 100,000 US adult. And so if we look at the Black rate, we see that 1,500 per 100,000 people are incarcerated, and we compare that to whites, we see that it's around 300. And the big point of this is that Black people are incarcerated 5 times the rate of white people. That's really systematic. But when you look in terms of the population, and you see the little graph to the right, you see that Black people only make up 13% of the population. And so this is just an example of how the policies, the treatment of people in the prison system has inequitable outcomes that favor white people and are disproportionate to Black people. And one thing I want to know is that, a lot of people sometimes think that you can think that crime is the reason that Black and Hispanics are disproportionately incarcerated in America. And that is an interesting thought, and we'll talk about that later, so just hold on to that. So thinking about those statistics, let's turn this around and look at STEM. And so right now we see that from science and engineering occupations that Black people make up 11.5% of the population. And so I want you just to think about, if you see this population number, how many Black people do you think, what percentage of Black people do you think are in STEM education and are in STEM occupations? So think about that. All right, and I'll add the full table in a second for you to see it. And so here we have the full table. So when I add it, we see that around half of Black population earned college degrees, and then about a third of them are in science and education occupations. And this is very disproportionate, right? When we look down below here at white percentages, we see that they're pretty stable. They might have some differences, but on the whole, their numbers are not going down. And so we want to just keep in mind that we see this in Latinx as well. We don't see it in Asian. And so the key here is that minorities that are underrepresented in their area based on population is what we'd like to call URMs. So we're going to use this term a lot, and just keep in mind that that's what we're talking about. And that's why we're not including Asian, because they are represented in this graph. And even though this is from 2010, I have some other stats that show us that this is relevant today. Now, so this is a new table. We see it compares 1995 to 2017, and we see that not much has changed. If you look over at the line of Black African American, you see that you just don't see much of a difference. What you do want to notice, though, at the bottom is that you see a difference in white occupations and white degrees. And so you ask, where is that difference going? Where it's not really going by being more inclusive to Black people. We have a little raise in Hispanic or Latinx, and then we have considerable raise in Asians. And unfortunately, Native Americans are very marginal, and that's also something that we definitely want to focus on. But for the sake of this, we're looking at Black. And then, so what happens when underrepresented minorities are not in education? Well, it just translates into more underrepresentation in careers. And so we can see here that these graphs show the same type of disparities in education and in occupation. And this just looks at STEM workforce in 2013. And when we look at, when we break it down for gender, we see that it's the same, but in the sense that, you know, Black women are way behind in Black men in this STEM workforce. So now let's go back to police data, because I did my research in police. And so what we want to see here real quick is that when in California, when we collect data on police officers, which is a new thing because it hasn't been done in a systematic way, we see that Black people are stopped 1.8 times more than whites. We also see that they're searched 2.9 times more than whites. And so when you think about the amount that they're being stopped and searched, you might think that the rate at which the search yields contraband or evidence would be really high based on these numbers of searching and stopping. But what we really find is that when we look at the search yield rate for everybody, all ethnic groups are lower than white individuals. And so this is just another example of institutional racism, where the policies and practices of this organization are resulting in inequitable outcomes for Black people. And this just goes back to the conversation that it's really not about crime, because if it was about crime, then the yield rates for Black people would be substantially higher based on the number of times that they've been pulled over and searched. And lastly, this is the last part of criminal justice, just to give us some context about the recent killings of Black people in America. Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than white people. And when you think about Black people being unarmed, they're 1.3 times more likely to be killed. And it's not about crime, right? So this data puts on the map police killing rates from largest to smallest, and then it plots violent crime rates. And you can see that there's really no correlation between people being killed and violent crime rates. And so when we think about these disparities in criminal justice and STEM, what is it? We know for criminal justice, it's not about crime. And we know for STEM, it's not because of lack of interest, because I have a graph that will show us that Black and Latinx enter STEM majors the same rate as their peers, they just leave. And so we have to think about what is causing them to do this. And so one way that we can really think about explaining these disparities is using the critical race theory. And so critical race theory is a unique way to account for what happens in society by theorizing the role of race, racism, and power in all sectors of life. And so in critical race theory in education, specifically STEM, we would want to look at the role that racism, and power plays in students persisting to STEM majors, which moves them on into STEM careers. So there is a lot of research that documents the underrepresentation of minorities in STEM, but there is not a really big consensus on why. Sometimes researchers look at academic preparedness, they look at scientific identity, they look at social factors, they look at a lot of things. One of the things they really look at too is sense of belonging. And sense of belonging is really important because it talks about the person's, it's the idea of someone's connection to the institution, right? Do they view themselves as expendable? right? Are they connected to the cultures and values of this place where they're getting their education? And so when we look at underrepresented minorities, we see that they report lower sense of belonging than their white and Asian and multicultural students. And this is really important because when we look at underrepresented minorities with a low sense of belonging, it is associated with lower persistence in college overall. And so we want to understand what is causing them to have a low sense of belonging to this university. And before we go further, here's the graph that I was referring to. You can see in this first column, it shows the rate at which students start off in STEM. And it's pretty similar. I think it's like 17, 18, 19% between all three of them. And so it's not that just Latinx and Black people are starting off really low, it's that they're there, it's just something is systematically causing them to leave. So when we think about why underrepresented minorities are less likely to persist in STEM, we want to break down persistence by race. And so it's important that when we're being anti-racist, that we understand the history of America, right? But then we also view data in disaggregated ways, because every race's experience in America is going to be different. And so the things that explain for one race may not explain for the other. And we want, in critical race theory, we're looking at the role of the race and racism. And so we can't lump all them together. So when we look at Black and Latinx youth, we see that they are more likely to switch from STEM and earn a degree than white and Asian students. And the interesting thing is that when you think about academic preparedness and social background, institutional characteristics as things that explain why they persist, there's differences. It doesn't explain it the same way for Latinx that it explains for Black students. And so now that we've looked at race and see that there's differences in how different races are in STEM, we need to look at the role of racism, and that's quite different than race. And so in order to look at racism, we need to use 6 tenets of education. And so the first one is that race is endemic to American culture. The history graph and the slides we did earlier, that's to show how endemic it is in America. So we know that. Then on top of that, we need to reject the dominant narratives, processes, or systems that claim race neutrality, color blindness, and meritocracy. And the reason we need to reject them is because if racism is endemic to America, then that means these dominant narratives are not beneficial for people of a different race than white because of the social hierarchy. The next thing is that racism is deeply rooted in origins that attribute white people with dominant status, non-white people with subordinate status. This is white supremacy, right? We discussed that. And this one, next one is really important. In order to look at racism, we have to look at the voices and lived experience of people of color as legitimate to generate oppositional discourse. And this is really important in STEM because when we look at lived experiences, a lot of the times we're talking about qualitative research. And so sometimes qualitative research can be seen as anecdotal and that it's not valid. But one thing that's very interesting is when I worked on this police research, it was the interviews, right? It was the qualitative data from police officers that help us uncover why disparities were still happening in the outcomes in terms of arrests, stop and search, use of force for African Americans. And so we just want to give some validity to people's experiences in a qualitative way. And it's not that quantitative data doesn't help us, it's actually that when they're paired together, they both are instrumental in looking at the role of race, racism, and power. And so you can see that the disparity exists when you use quantitative data, and then you can understand why and how it keeps happening when you look at qualitative data. The next thing to note, which is really important too, is that recognition of entrance conversions. And so this is kind of what's going on today, right? It's understanding that racial justice will be accommodated by the larger society. So when the interests align for racial justice and the larger white society, then we will see racial justice. And so you can understand that it's not that these things just started happening this year, they've been happening for a really long time. It's just that now society is aligning with racial justice, and we hope to see some change. And then lastly is that racism eradication is tied to eliminating all forms of oppression. And so this includes like sexism and other oppression from marginalized groups based on sexual orientation, right? You just can't eradicate racism by itself and then act like it's in a vacuum. Okay, so now that we have those tenets to help us understand how to look at racism, let's look at the role of racism in persistence for African Americans in STEM. And so when we look at race for Black women, we see that racism and sexism is something that they face together, and it's very hard for them to tease out, is it because they're Black or is it because they're a woman, right? And then they have to have stereotypes about academic identity. Do they fit into this major? Do they fit into this group, right? And then intellectual capacity of, can they do the work that requires them to be successful here? They also talk about how they're faced with cultural isolation by both white males because of their race, but then also because of Black males because of sexism. And so when we look at Black males, we see that they're faced with similar things, but also different, right? They don't have an issue with sexism by nature of them being males, but they do experience negative encounters with students, instructors, and advisors. And sometimes advisors and instructors will discourage them from taking courses when they show slight difficulty, or maybe not even respond to them when they seek follow up for like looking to be in a future grad program, and somebody won't respond to them. And so they also face intellectual capacity stereotypes with students and things like that. But one thing specifically they know is that they face microaggressions more as they move up into upper class. And this is interesting because when you're thinking about moving up into upper class and then think about grad school, the next level, this is something that you really want to deal with. And lastly, that they also face isolation, but they seek support at Black resource centers. And so one of the things to note is that there's not a lot of racism, or not a lot of research on the role of race in the qualitative area. And that's interesting because racism and talking about race has been taboo. And so we want to note that when students are talking about their persistent struggle, they might not off the top of their head be willing to talk about race as the issue unless it's framed in a race theory, because talking about racism has been so taboo. And we'll talk about what it does to students when it's taboo. Okay, so let's go on. This is something you want to read really quickly. And this is an example from a Black professional leaving STEM. Okay, and so when we look at this, we see that a student, or a professional, actually, he was a student, talks about the issues that he faced. He talks about being the only Black person for 4 years. He talks about how he has to move to the other side of town where more Black people live to find community, right? He can't find it in his job or his school. And then at the end, he talks about how he was told he was articulate. We'll cover that a little bit. And then he finally says at the end that science was a place I ultimately left, not so much because I wanted to, but because I had to. And so one thing to know is that there's not a lot of research that looks into the role that racism plays in STEM persistence. And so this is really a great opportunity to have a cross collaboration of departments within the CSUPERB CSU system to look at how does race affect our Black and Latinx students leaving the STEM major. And so when we think about this racism that we see Black individuals in STEM describe, we want to think about how to spot them. And so one way we can spot racism, is in implicit bias. And so implicit bias is a psychological term, And it's a way that we can look at racism, since we know that racism has changed from overt to covert. And so what we want to focus here, some definitions, that it's introspectively unidentified or incorrectly identified traces of past experience that mediate attributions of qualities to members of social categories. So it's the way our mind makes shortcuts from the media, past experience, things that we've seen, and we attribute these qualities to a certain type of a certain type of member in a social category. And so one thing we also want to note is that actors do not always have conscious or internal control over their processes of social perception, impression formation, and judgment that motivates their action. And so we want to really focus that implicit bias is unconscious, it's subconscious, and the prejudices and negative attitudes towards certain type of people can be misidentified or unidentified. And so your brain doesn't know how to think about something, so it shortcuts it to what it knows, or it's misidentified, meaning that it only thinks about it in negative views because that's what society, or that's what we've been exposed to. Okay, so here's an implicit bias riddle. If you want to just take a moment to read this. It says, a father and his son are in a terrible car crash. The father dies at the scene. His son, in critical condition, is rushed to the hospital. He's in the operating room, about to go under the knife. The surgeon says, I can't operate on this boy. He's my son. And so how is this possible? That's the question for the riddle. And so this riddle is often used in implicit bias trainings, right? You might have seen this before if you've done implicit bias, or you might not. But responses generally include that it's two gay fathers, right? That the father died and the other father is the surgeon, right? That it's one biological father, it's like a adopted godfather, or that it's one father that was a biological father, and then there's one father that's like the religious priest. And however, there's an obvious answer that most people, including myself, missed when I first read this, is that the surgeon could be the boy's mother, right? And so sometimes we are conditioned to associate doctors, surgeons with being male. And so this just shows us that we might not want to think that it couldn't have been the mom, but it's the idea that it's unconscious, it's subconscious, it's what our brain has brought in, the information that has come into our brain, and we make these shortcuts. And so think about, when we think about conditioning, think about how Black students in STEM are dealing with how people are conditioned about them and how this dictates how they're treated. And so we kind of saw some of that in the studies that showed what students face between African-American males and females. And so we can see that there's definitely some ideal that people think about them in a certain way. And so we want to change that. All right, let's look at some examples of implicit bias. First, we can look at students towards students. In a study from University of Washington of about 1,700 students, male students were found to underestimate female peers in biology. And so between faculty and students, we see that when instructors remove identifying information before grading, that the grades for females and minority students go up. And another thing to note is that some research found that faculty were more significantly responsive to white males for prospective student interviews than all other categories combined. And so this kind of goes back into the other research where students talks about how advisors and instructors, they don't reach out to them or follow up with them when they're interested in like going to grad school or something. And then this last one, which is not STEM restricted, but it does help see how it affects students in the job market, is that when candidates whiten their CVs, they're more likely to be interviewed. So when they show that they're not a minority, right, or maybe, right, that they are more likely to be interviewed. And so we want to understand implicit bias in our community, especially CSUPERB, but we want to make sure that we don't perpetuate it. And so here's where we're going to do a lot of work in how to not perpetuate implicit bias. And so one of the ways that implicit bias can be perpetuated is through microaggressions. And so microaggressions comes from Dr. Pierce from Harvard. He's a psychiatrist, and he defines them as subtle, innocuous, preconscious, or unconscious degradations and put downs. They're often kinetic, but capable of being verbal and or kinetic. And so we want to note that they're commonplace verbal behavior actions that communicate hostility towards a type of oppressed or targeted group. And they're also small, and they can be daily, and we want to think about their cumulative effect. And so it's important to note that everyone has probably done a microaggression. One example of a microaggression is using the common phrase, well, it's not so common anymore, but when I was growing up, it was common, that's so gay, right? That's homophobic, that's insulting, that's calling gay people weird, that's calling gay people bad or negative. And it's just really subtle, right? It's commonplace, but it shows hostility towards a type of people. And so we want to think also about using things such as the color black to denote bad. So black male, black sheep, right? Black Friday, like these are things that associated the term black with bad. And if you're somebody of the black race, then, you know, that's just associating your identity with bad. And so we want to focus now on racial microaggressions. And so they're the same as microaggressions, except that they have racial slights and racial insults towards people of color. And so some things we want to know about microaggressions: they're small and they can be easily explained away, and they can be perpetuated by anyone because racism happens in our culture. It's endemic in our culture. It's structural in our culture. Anyone can perpetuate a racial microaggression, right? And the idea that it's cumulative, that it happens all the time. It can feel like a tiny little cuts or a lot of bee stings. The effect is big. And so we don't want the word micro to minimize the effect that it can have on someone's quality of life. Most of microaggressions are done unconscious or implicitly, but they can turn into explicit bias. And that's really something that we saw in our police research. It's that they would start off in an implicit way, but then they would graduate into this explicit racism by saying, we stopped this person because of the color of their race, because they didn't belong in this neighborhood. And so it's just not to say all bias is implicit, but that we can move in between them, but we want to focus on implicit today. They can be nonverbal, and they can also be with action. Oops. Okay, so here's a little chart to help us look at make sure I didn't skip too many slides here. Here's a chart to help us, look at microaggressions. In the middle, it talks about micro assaults, and that's often conscious and explicit name calling, right? And so we're not going to really focus on that because that's something right now society knows that that's not appropriate. And it's often done in public places, and it's not really in the classrooms, and we don't really want to focus on that. But just know that it's there. We want to look at micro insult and micro invalidation. And so micro insults are rude, snide, or demeaning comments, and they may not be offered as malice, but the underlying message is insulting. And it's really important to be able to tease out that underlying message, or else it can be explained away, right? And so the underlying message, the idea that it's unconscious, that it's our subconscious is, right, we want to have some parallels here. And micro invalidations are things that negate the experience of people of color. And so this goes back to the idea of why talking about race is taboo, and it's because race has been viewed as a topic that's off limits in our culture, and when people bring it up, that it can be seen as an attack. And so you'll hear people say like, oh, you're just pulling the race card, when in fact it's just someone's lived experience in America. Okay, so here's some general examples of microaggressions, and go ahead and read those. Okay, so let's move on. And break these microaggressions down. So here's some themes. They're not all the themes, but these are definitely themes that can affect students and faculty of color in this college environment. And so the myth of meritocracy. And so the myth of meritocracy is, you know, the ideal that people are given unfair benefits for their race. And so when you look at a microaggression that says, are you an affirmative action hire? Or you must have gone to college because you checked Black on your application, right? This is asserting that the idea is that we think that role has a minor part of our success, right? If we think about meritocracy, it doesn't have a place for race, but that's not true given our society is endemic to racist culture. And so when you focus on this for Black people, it just makes them feel that they are given unfair benefits because of the color of their skin. And it's not that they're not given benefits, it's that somehow these benefits are unfair. And so we just want to think about that and think about our history in America and how many people have benefited unfairly from Black people. And then now if they're given benefits, then now somehow they're seen as unfair. So the next one we want to look at is pathologizing cultural values communication styles. And so something like, your name is too difficult for me, do you have a nickname, right? This is the ideal that the person should assimilate to dominant culture, that their culture is not valued because it's not part of the dominant culture. And so we know if we're thinking about white supremacy, we're thinking about the dominant culture being white. And so if someone has a name or something that's from a different culture, changing that, asking them to change that is asking them to assimilate to dominant culture instead of respecting or valuing their specific culture. Ascription of intelligence, right? This is assigning a degree of intelligence to a person based on their race. And so here's one, are you here on a sports scholarship? People of color, and the message is people of color are not generally as intelligent as white. So the only way you could be in this space is by you having sports, not because of your intellect. And then denial of individual racism. This is really important because this is denying a person's experience of racism and also denying that you can perpetuate racism. And so saying things like, I'm not racist, I have several Black friends, right? This sends the message that someone is immune to racism because of proximity to people of color. And we really know that that's not true. When we think about the founding fathers, when we think about, if you watch Hamilton, you know that there are founding fathers who had slaves, who even had slave children. And so proximity to people of color is not a reason to say that you can't be racist. And it's also denying that you ever perpetuated. And so we want to talk about being anti-racist. We want to make sure that we don't deny the experience of people, and that we also don't deny that we could have perpetuated it. Okay, so now that we've talked about these things, how do you respond to microaggressions when you perpetuate it? So the first thing to remember is everyone commits microaggressions. It's endemic, especially racial ones. It's endemic to our culture. So take a moment, pause. The next thing to do is confront your own bias by asking yourself questions such as, do I really know why I say that? Would I have said that to someone of my race, or maybe someone who's white? Why was I feeling threatened, and why? And so you want to do some introspection for yourself. The next thing to do when you're thinking about being anti-racist is to apologize and own up to it, right? Because being anti-racist is someone who fights against these systems at the personal, structural, and institutional level. The next thing when you're apologizing is don't force people to acknowledge your good intention. And then if you had good intentions and it didn't materialize, that's okay. Learn from it. And then the next interaction, have those good intentions materialize, and it will be fine. The next thing is seek feedback and advice. And you might want to seek feedback and advice all through this process, right? If someone has let you know you've done a microaggression, you might want to think about it, but then also consult with people, like maybe you're not sure how this happened, or you don't understand it. You want to seek advice, but you also want to make sure that it's on their terms and not your terms, because it's actually really nobody's responsibility to teach you. We're going to give you a list of resources when we send out the survey, and so you'll be able to educate yourself. The next thing to do is commit and learn on your own time to follow through, and that's where the resources will really come in handy. So how to respond to microaggressions when it happens to you. You still want to pause, and you want to ask yourself, did this microaggression really occur? One of the things that can happen is because they're so small and that they're so endemic into culture and popular commonplace that they can be easily explained away. And so you need to state what happened, and that's in your journal, that's with a friend, that's in a phone call, but state what happened. And if you really feel like a microaggression happened, then you'll just decide later on how to respond. You want to think about the risk and consequences of responding or not responding to a microaggression. And because, you know, it might not be in your favor to do it. And when you're thinking about that, don't feel pressure to call out every microaggression against you. Just know you have the right, you're not disruptive. And regardless of should you just decide to respond or not, you should seek support, because this can have deleterious effects on your life. All right, and now, when you decide to respond to it, you want to think about how you should respond to this microaggression. And so in the education world, we definitely want to probably have mentors, advisors, people who have dealt with this thing before that can really help us navigate the best way we should respond to this. One, because it can be uncomfortable, right? The perpetrator may not listen, they may become defensive, they might have an argument, if it's with your professor, if it's with a colleague, if it's with your boss, you know, it just might get uncomfortable for you. So you want to definitely have someone help you navigate that. You want to ask some uncomfortable questions. Ask the person why they said that, why they did that. Ask them to clarify, you know, in hopes that they'll be able to see, oh, wow, maybe that was really hurtful. And maybe they don't. But then the thing that you want to focus on is that you want to focus on their behavior and not use attacks or name calling, and focus on I statements. But don't shy away from reinforcing how you feel, right? It's not about good intentions, it's about what happened. And then lastly, even if it's uncomfortable, the problem still needs to be addressed, and you definitely have the right to address it. Now, this next way is kind of from a bystander perspective, but it also aligns with if it happens to you. And so one of the things you want to do is redirect the conversation or stop and intervene, right? You want to ask those probing questions. Hey, can you clarify? What did you mean by that, right? You want to clarify the values of your institution. Hey, our institution is a safe space. We respect all cultures, right? Let them know that this is not really tolerated. And then emphasize your own thoughts, whether you were the person who was microaggressed against or you happen to see it. Emphasizing how it made you feel is important to let the person know other people have thoughts about this, right? And then next steps, decide how you're going to follow up with the person, whether that's diversity training, whether that's more discussions, or just next steps so that this doesn't happen anymore. Okay, so now that we went through all this, we're nearing down the end. What to do next? Keep in mind that being anti-racist is an ongoing journey. And so the first thing you want to make sure, which we've covered today, but you can go in more in depth, is understanding the history of racism in America and how it's perpetuated now. Once you look at that, you want to confront ideology that's racist that you might have or that you did have. And a good way to do that is to take the implicit association test. That's through the Harvard University, and it's from researchers who came up with the concept of implicit bias, right? Then you want to talk with people with an open mind about their perspective on race. And keep in mind, this is not a one-time thing, and it may be awkward at first because talking about race has been so taboo and it has been denied that people, you know, it's not the natural thing to do outside of your immediate culture. And then now we're going to get active on campus. A couple things to do is consult your Center for Teacher and Learning on campus on ways to make your classroom inclusive. Some ways are to amplify Black and other minority contributions in STEM, and also be intentional about diversity inclusion in your hiring, your collaboration, your allocation of resources. Just make sure that you're thinking about those types of things, right? And also go to your diversity and inclusion office. And if you don't have a diversity and inclusion office, now is the time to push for one. You also want to identify other racial inequities, disparities in society, because anti-racism is a journey, and we know that racism happens on all type of levels. And so we want to make sure that we're aware outside of our culture or outside of our personal lives and our specific work areas. And then being anti-racist is about doing stuff. So you want to intervene when you see microaggressions or when you see policies in place that are disproportionately affecting people of color. And you also want to be vocal to support anti-racist policies and ideas. And so that can be in your mission statements, in your syllabus, just to let people know that we're really about being anti-racist. And then lastly, you know, when COVID-19 lets us out, volunteer and support anti-racist organizations. And so that concludes our discussion or our presentation part on my end. And so I'll turn it over to Bianca.